Hello everyone and welcome to my video boss fight guide for Tyth, the first boss in Gods from the Machine in hard or veteran mode difficulty. This is a fairly straightforward fight, but unlike some of the earlier operations in SWTOR, Tyth has just enough randomness to some of his mechanics and just enough unpredictability in how that will inform kind of the timing and strategy that requires a number of kind of split-second decisions. Those things put together can make Tyth a surprisingly difficult boss fight for the first boss in an operation. Although for the most part the mechanics are simple, so it just kind of requires each team to put together a good effective strategy. So I'm going to be assuming that anyone watching this is familiar with story mode. I'll link the story mode guide in the comments, in the description, as well as there's a text guide and resources. So just kind of assume everyone's kind of good to go with the basic layout and structure to this fight in story mode. We're going to be talking about things that are specific to hard mode, as well as things that maybe you kind of could ignore in story mode, but that really matter in hard mode. Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, so one big difference in this fight is the adds. In story mode, you only get 3 adds while Tyth is above 60%, and then you get a 4th one when he goes below 60. That you get 1 extra add in hard mode at both points. So above 60%, you're going to get 4 adds at the positions numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. You'll get those every 30 seconds or so. And then once you get Tyth below 60% health, the next wave of adds will spawn a little more like about every 35, 36 seconds, and you'll get a 5th add that'll be at one of those random positions. So this is important in a couple of ways. First, you have 1 extra add every wave, which means Tyth is naturally going to be building stacks of rage faster, which means it's going to be harder to keep his rage under control, which we'll talk more about that in a moment. The second thing is, depending on the type of add, that can also be a real pain, because some of them are more annoying than others, which means the variability of each wave is going to be a little bit more challenging. And probably last, in my experience, the most important, if you wherever you are holding Tyth, usually you want to hold him like on the map here, kind of equidistant between one of those 2 spots. We hold him on the right on the map. As you drop down, it would be on your left. Is usually where we like to hold him, but you could do it anywhere. When you do that there, you got to be really careful for an add spawning kind of underneath, right in front of, right behind the boss. So we'll talk a little about this in a moment, but essentially that kind of informs your strategy, that you got to be really careful about that and either make sure that a DPS picks up that add or everyone nukes it down really quickly if it spawns so it doesn't get cleaved by the boss. Or you have to be watching for it and know that you need to pull Tyth forward so that he is past the add, so the add spawns behind him so it doesn't get cleaved. Because as you'll see in hard mode, if you can cleave maybe 1 add and maybe be okay, that kind of puts you behind. But if you end up cleaving more than 1 add, then you're really gonna have a tough time unless that happens like right before you kill him, because his rage overload's just very damaging. So that's kind of the positioning. So let's keep going. Okay, so now let's briefly recap the whole rage and rage decay, because this is important too. Now in a few seconds we're getting adds, we're zoomed in on Tyth's focus target bar, so watch his buff bar. Right, so he's got the whole rage buff, and now we're about to start killing adds here in a few seconds. You're going to start seeing buffs pop up. So boom, there he is, 1 stack of rage. He's about to get more stacks. You see the white buff that's counting down. So it didn't quite count down, so now we're to 3. Notice every time we add a stack of rage, the white timer resets. But now it's counting down. We killed all 4 adds in that wave, so now it's counting down. So now it expires, we drop to 3, and now it refreshes, and it counts down again. Every time you kill an add, that timer resets. Every time you let it expire, you drop a stack of rage. This is going to be important in how you deal with killing adds, because if you go and let's say you have 1 DPS killing adds, or everyone goes from 1 add to 1 add to 1 add to 1 add, you may spend anywhere from 20 to 30 seconds killing adds. And if you do that, every time you're about to kill an add, you're going to reset that timer, and you won't drop any stacks naturally, meaning that you could go from 4 stacks and you wouldn't drop any from that wave until the next wave, where then you're going to get 4 more, and now you're up to 8. And so it's really critical that not only you kill the adds, but you do so in as tight a fashion as possible so that you maximize the amount of time for stacks to drop off. So here you see, if you're watching, we eventually got our stacks down to 0. Now, the Grace Droid can help with that but you don't want to just depend on the Grace Droid, or it's going to really prolong the fight. We'll talk about that in a moment too. So generally the way to do this is if you can get all the ads grouped up, you want to use all your AoEs and kind of AoE them down so that hopefully all of them die within a few seconds of each other, and you lose very little time on that rage decay timer. The other thing is if you kill most of the ads and there's one left and it's relatively low on health and you see that rage decay is about to tick off, wait 2 or 3 GCDs for it to tick off, drop a stack of rage, and then kill it. This is a fairly minor thing, but for teams that are really skilled in either grouping up ads to be efficient or timing when they kill the ads, this can really, really help, because fundamentally Tyth himself is really, really simple. There's only really one extra mechanic that's new in hard mode, so it really comes down to not cleaving ads with Tyth and then just managing these stacks of rage. So hopefully this is helpful. It's something that not everyone pays really close attention to, but anytime I'm leading a Tyth op or anytime I am on ad duty, this is something that I pay really, really, really close attention to, and trying to time when to call out to burn ads, or if I'm finishing off ads, when to wait. So I wait for it to tick down and then bam. Okay, so one other thing we need to talk about is Intensify Rage. This mechanic exists in story mode, but it's a little different in hard mode. So in story mode, anytime you get below 30% health, Tyth will naturally add 1 stack of rage every 12 seconds. And there's an announcement that says Tyth's rage intensifies. So this makes you slightly favorable in terms of dropping rage, because you're dropping one stack every 8 seconds if you're not killing ads, and gaining 1 every 12. So over 24 seconds, you drop 3 and you gain 2. Well, in hard mode, it's 2 stacks get added by Intensify Rage. So over that same period, over 24 seconds, you're dropping 3 and adding 4, which means no matter what you do, you're going to be moving closer and closer and closer to getting to 10 and getting that Rage Overload that's just going to start chain spamming and nuking the group unless he's really, really low when that happens. Or you can rely on the Grace Droids, but I don't really recommend that in burn phase because it dramatically lengthens the phase. So something to bear in mind, you want to be coordinated. We'll talk a little more about this in strategy, but as much as you can, you want to kind of have your stacks be as low as you can, and ads, the room be as clear as you can of ads before you go into burn, because you just will not have much room for error because of that Intensify Rage. Okay, so now let's see an example of what not to do. So now we're kind of in a dangerous spot where we're going sub 30. We're having the inversion, that's the new mechanic, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And so now we're up to 5 stacks because we cleaved an ad, because an ad came in during inversion, which we'll talk about. So now we're at 5 stacks. We're at 20%. He doesn't have that much health left. We ought to be able to burn him, but we got to be careful. So in this case, we're trying to deal with a couple of the ads. We got to keep him out of the way. We're trying to burn him. Now it's 6 stacks. He's not naturally dropping off stacks very quickly because he keeps adding more. So now we're at 5, and now we've got more ads. So now we have about 8 or 9 ads up. It's going to be tough not to cleave one. We're at 6, 7. Now everyone runs in for inversion, which you'll see. And now we're going to cleave some ads. And so we're at really close. We're at a couple of percentage points. He's at 11. Now that's 1 cast. Hits the group. There's a 2nd cast. Almost everyone's dead. Then another one. And we kill him right as that goes out and survive with 1 person alive. So these Rage Storms are really dangerous. And anytime he kills an ad with Rage Storm, that's going to add stacks. You see he got up to 20-something stacks, and thankfully he was just low enough that 1 person could finish him off before he started chain spamming it. So especially once you get to burn phase, since you usually are going to want to ignore ads, rage management is so important, because once he hits Rage Overload, he's just going to probably be spamming it, and unless he's really, really low, that's going to be a wipe. So again, we're going to talk about inversion now, but really the most important thing is ads, because you guys will get inversion under control really quickly if you haven't seen it before. So anyway, let's talk about that now. Okay, so now let's talk about the main extra mechanic added in hard mode. Now that we've spent all this time talking about ads, let's talk about inversion. Inversion is a new mechanic in hard or veteran mode that's going to happen. It'll happen about 20 seconds into the fight, so it happens a little faster when you first pull, and then it'll happen 40 seconds after that continuously throughout the fight. Inversion is basically going to be a big circle around the boss, as you see graphically here. It's fairly large. I'd say about 15 or so meters in radius, so 30 in diameter, so it's pretty big. and there's a 5-second cast. So he'll start casting Inversion. You'll have 5 seconds to get positioned for the Inversion mechanic. It's also worth noting Star Parse is great for this because it has a built-in timer for it. Although you should know the timer is based on the end of the Inversion cast. So if the timer says 10 seconds, what that means is you have 5 seconds until the cast starts, and then 10 seconds or 5 more seconds until Inversion ends, and you need to be positioned where you need to be. So what does Inversion do? Well, it does kind of a bunch of things. So first, and perhaps most importantly, anyone that's outside of the circle is going to be pulled into the circle. Anybody inside the circle is going to be thrown out. And then depending on whether you're pulled in or thrown out, you're going to get a different buff that has different effects. We'll talk about that in a second. Important thing to note is from a positioning perspective, it doesn't matter where you are outside of the circle. You could be on the far end of the platform or just a few meters outside of the platform. So that doesn't really matter. Where you are inside the circle matters a very, very great deal. So I've tried to illustrate it here where we've got a DPS marker, a DPS player that's very close to the boss, and then a healer and a tank that are kind of right at the far edge of the circle. And so the closer you are to the boss, the further you are going to be thrown, and you're going to be thrown through the boss. So think of it like the boss is using this gravity mechanic to grab everyone in the raid and pull them towards him, and in fact pull them past him and be thrown a certain distance. And the closer you are to him, the further you get thrown. The way the game's mechanics work is it's tiered. And so the optimal distance is you want to be at least 7.5 meters from the boss, which basically means you need to be on the outer half of the circle. If you're in that outer ring, you'll be thrown about half of the diameter of the platform. So if you have the circle positioned where you're on the very back edge, you'll be thrown approximately into the middle-ish area of the room. You can also angle him where you're thrown at a diagonal. You can see the healer here is positioned so they get thrown kind of to the lower middle of the platform. If you are very close to the boss, you'll be thrown almost the entire distance. Where the DPS player is positioned, even though they're almost on the far east edge of the map, they will be thrown almost to the very edge of the platform. They might be safe, depending on exactly where Tyth is. They might still be okay, or they might be thrown off. Important to note, if they're positioned in any way other than being thrown directly across the longest stretch of the circle, if they're positioned at heal marker or the healer or the tank position, they'd probably die because they'd be thrown too far and be thrown off the platform. So this means for Inversion, anyone in the circle has to be outside of Tyth, and they need to be in the outer half of the circle when the cast ends. You need to be careful about lag here, so get to your position quickly and early if you can, and then once you get there, jump or move to the side or something like that to help ensure the game updates your position in a timely fashion. The other thing we need to talk about is resonant implosion. So if nobody stands out, if everybody stands inside the circle, somebody is going to get basically one shot by resonant implosion. I'm not 100% sure as to how the mechanics work, but it seems to be usually a DPS, and it's usually like kind of the DPS who's either at the top of the aggro table or top of the threat table or close to it. So you have to have at least one person stand out. Okay, so now let's talk about the debuffs. Why do you need people to do each thing? Okay, so now let's see how Inversion works in a live environment. Now we're going to pull here. I'm the off tank, meaning I'm going to stand out and be pulled in for the first Inversion. That's always the way you want to do it. The tank with aggro stays in. Generally, all the DPS and healers go in. The other tank stays out, and you facilitate a tank swap. Why is that? Well, there's a debuff called Meltdown that gets applied to the tank that reduces their healing received by 10% per stack, and it lasts 60 seconds. So if you don't swap on Inversion, then eventually the other tank will, you won't receive any healing. So I get pulled in. Now I've got the boss. Inversion facilitates that tank swap because everyone inside the circle gets thrown out and gets a green Inversion Resonance Shortwave buff that for 8 seconds they are unable to build threat by Tyth, and it wipes their threat with Tyth, which makes it generally almost impossible for them to pull threat. Whereas I got pulled in, I got a purple buff that dramatically increases my threat generation and gives me a nice 12-second DR buff as well, which is really handy. So again, that's the basic mechanics. tank with aggro stands in. Notice I'm positioning to be thrown. The other tank gets pulled in, and then they take the boss. An important pro tip for this is occasionally threat can be an issue. If you have a DPS that's standing out by accident, let's say they're killing adds and they lose track of their positioning, they're not able to get there in time. And if you're not sure, because of the positioning, if you run into that circle but you don't get past Tyth, then you'll be thrown over his shoulder directly off the platform. So sometimes that's just what has to happen. When that happens, it's really important to be able to use your taunts. What I've found works really, really well to avoid any aggro issues is if the tank being pulled in taunts just before they get pulled in. Notice I taunted there right before I got pulled in. Then what you effectively do is I get to piggyback off the other tank's aggro. And so I get their multiplier, I get pulled into Tyth, and now not only do I have a buff to my threat generation and my DR, but I'm piggybacking off of theirs while all of their threat got wiped to 0, which essentially means now it's impossible for me to lose threat unless I stealth out or do something crazy, or unless somebody else taunts. Okay, so let's take a look at these buffs, because this is, I think, important just to be aware of, and most people don't really see it. Okay, so here's a screenshot of kind of focusing in on the raid frame. During that pull, you see that the tank at the top left got pulled in. They got the Inversion Resonance Long Wave, which is kind of the reddish, pinkish, purple debuff that reduces their damage and healing, but increases their threat generation for 12 seconds. Everyone else got the green one, which is the shortwave debuff that increases damage and healing, but you don't build any threat and your threat gets wiped. So ideally, this is the way you kind of want to do it. You alternate where the tanks alternate that so that they manage the stacks of meltdown, which if you're watching any of these videos I've shown so far, you'll see that the tanks are getting applied to that. That's different from the other debuff that you get in story mode, armor melt, that's cleansable. This one looks like, I think it's Withering Terror is one of the dot abilities for Inquisitors. It looks like that, but it's not cleansable, and that's why you have to tank swap. Okay, so here's just a graphical layout of a lot of that same stuff with a little bit extra stuff layered on. Again, one of the key things during inversion is dealing with adds, as we've talked about. That inversion is an extra nuance, but the purpose of the inversion mechanic is, number one, to require a tank swap, which, okay, that's kind of not a big deal. But even that is all based around dealing with adds, because if you have the off tank grabbing adds and then they need to be pulled into the boss, how are you going to keep those adds out from underneath the boss or his cleave? One hit with either of his cleaves, either the short wide one or the conal one, the rectangular conal one. Any of those, if they hit an add, instantly dies, and boom, you get 3 or 4 stacks of rage. And if you do, you can clip one of those safely, but if you hit 2, it's going to be almost impossible to come back from it without him overloading. So everyone else is running under the boss. So if DPS are killing adds, but don't quite kill them, they'll follow them under the boss. If a healer is healing and the tanks say, hey, I don't want to get aggro on an add when I'm about to have to do a swap, so I'm not going to taunt them or whatever, they're going to aggro to the healer, so they're going to run under. So how do you deal with that? So the couple of thoughts. One thing is if one of your tanks or both of your tanks are assassins or shadow tanks, they can deal with adds a fair bit as long as they have their stealth up. And what they can then do is when it's their turn to be pulled in during the inversion cast, if it's obvious they're not going to kill the whatever adds they have aggro on at time, they can hit their stealth out and then get pulled in. I've noticed this is a little bit buggy where, like, if you're out of combat, I sometimes worry about it not picking up the mechanic, in which case what I suggest is you stealth out and then taunt Tyth during the cast. Again, as I described, that helps you piggyback off the other tank's aggro, so you stay really, really high on the threat table. But also that makes sure you're actually in combat so that the game doesn't mistakenly forget to register you and then somebody gets nuked because the game thinks that no one was standing outside. So the name of the game here is positioning. So you can see here that in the graphic, the tank inside the circle and the healer inside the circle are standing kind of at an angle. That's very deliberate, and the idea here is to keep adds out from directly underneath the boss. So the adds we worry about are the Guardians, which we'll talk a little more about the specific adds, but I assume everyone's familiar with those from the story mode guides and videos. The Guardians are the ones that worry you because they move very quickly. The other 3 really aren't too much of a worry to get under the boss. You see them coming from a mile away. The Guardians move very, very quickly to whomever has aggro, so those are the ones you worry about. Now, if you're a healer or a tank or even a DPS that had aggro on them for some reason, if you move to the side of the boss, that makes it a little bit safer, where if they're coming in at Tyth and then you get thrown out, as long as they're not all the way to you, so if they either haven't come all the way in or you find a way to slow them or root them, which is what we'll talk about next, then they're a little behind him, and once you get thrown out, they follow you out and they never actually step directly in front of him. If you stand where the DPS is standing, they're going to go right in front of Tyth, which means unless you're very, very lucky, they'll get cleaved on their way out. Now, if you're really savvy, another thing you could do is, if you know the tank doesn't have aggro, you could just have the tank position where they are here and just have everybody stand on the opposite side, which would also help a little bit just to make it that much safer. And you're also turning Tyth a little bit, and when the other tank gets pulled in, they go stand where the tank is now, so they keep Tyth faced away. Now, that's a little risky because the higher stacks of rage he has, the wider that conal is going to be, and the harder it is to turn him without cleaving something. But all of those are potentially viable strategies. This is really the key to success here, and this is where the RNG of where ads spawn, does one spawn underneath the boss, sub 60, can just really kind of make it difficult because you just can't really predict. The one thing I will say is I strongly recommend people using any utilities that give you knockback, stuns, roots. Like if you're a Sorc, Sage, Shadow, or Assassin, take electric bindings. So as those come in, you can hit them with your knockback. It'll root them for 5 seconds. And as long as you do that as they come in, that's perfect. As long as they're behind Tyth, they get rooted, you get thrown out, they follow you out, no big deal. A variety of tanks and other classes have stuns, AoE stuns, roots. A lot of those types of abilities work really well. So just be aware of what you can take. This is a good fight for a lot of those kind of traditionally PvP utilities that can be really handy because it's all about keeping the ads out from under Tyth. Okay, so now let's talk briefly about each ad. We'll go kind of in least important to most important. So we'll start with the Justice Droids. These moves, they're blue markers, so you can predict them on the ground. They move very, very slowly, and they maintain a powerful energy shield called Multi-Phase Shield, which is a buff around themselves. Any attacks from outside the shield get reflected, so you have to go in the shield to damage them. While you're in the shield, you'll start to build up stacks of charge buildup, which will deal damage. And it can be cleansed, but it does build up very, very quickly. The only way to bring it down is to use a stun or CC ability, or you can use the Lance Droid, which we'll talk about in a second. You can't use interrupts. That's important. So you have to be careful. If you can't use a Lance Droid, you basically have to kind of run in, stun it, damage it, CC it, or another stun if you have it, damage it, and then if you're still out, then you're going to have to use a self-cleanse or get a healer to cleanse you to burn them down. Early in the fight, usually one person stuns them and then everyone just nukes it. That's particularly convenient for range, that a melee leaps in and stuns it and everyone nukes it. Once you get past about 40% or so on health, depending on where your group is at from rage stacks, oftentimes we'll ignore these because they move so slowly, and they'll typically aggro to the healers as long as no one attacks them or uses an AoE taunt. It's usually pretty easy for the healers to kite these around, and just as long as the healers stand at about the middle of the room, they pull them far enough away from Tyth that once they run in for inversion, they won't get to Tyth by the time they get tossed back out. So these guys are kind of pesky, especially if you get 2 or 3 of them up at once. They can be a bit annoying, but as long as you kind of keep them out from underfoot from Tyth, are not too dangerous in hard mode. All right, next are Lance Droids. They're noted by a red little graphic on the ground before they spawn. They really don't move. The main thing they do is they'll chain cast Energy Lance, which is that red rectangular conal I'm sure you've seen, and you see in the graphic here. During its couple second cast time, you can move out of the telegraph and not get hit. Now, the attack itself doesn't do that much damage. You should avoid it just to avoid the damage. The real danger is really to tanks, particularly the tank holding the boss. If they get hit by it, they'll get a debuff called Shield Overload. It's a purple debuff that I'll try to call out on the next video we show here. If they get it, it reduces their shield chance by 100% for 10 seconds. So if you're tanking the Tyth and you stand in one of those or get clipped by it, then you're going to essentially just be kind of a DPS with really good armor for about 10 seconds. And so be careful about what defensives you use. If you have a good one that isn't going to be negatively impacted by not being able to shield or absorb attacks, so defense boosts or direct boosts to your DR or to your defense or something, those you may need to use those depending on your health. But so that's the main thing for these guys, is you got to keep them facing away from the main tank, particularly if you're leaving ads up during burn phase. The one good thing, though, is if you clip a Justice Droid with the Lance Beam, it will similarly deactivate their shield. So if you're really clever, you'll aim the Lance Droids at the Justice Droids, bring down their shield, and use that to nuke them. That way you can save your stuns and CCs for ads to keep them out from inversion. You don't have to do that, but that can be helpful. The main thing is just keep them away from the tanks while they're holding Tyth. Right, next is the Grace Droid. You may think to yourself, gee whiz, shouldn't that be the most important one? It really isn't in my mind, and I'll explain why in a moment. So the Grace Droid does the exact same stuff it does in story mode. It'll alternate between Avira's Restoration, which is the green beam. It'll do 3 of those, and then it'll do 1 Avira's Grace, which is a yellow beam. And it'll just keep doing that, in that pattern until you kill it. So just to recap, the green beam Avira's Restoration will drop 1 stack of rage from Tyth, but will heal Tyth for about 2% of his health. While Avira's Grace, the yellow cast, is a gold beam, and it will reduce 3 stacks of rage from Tyth, but will give him a 50% damage reduction buff for 12 seconds. So the Grace is dangerous in the sense that if you ignore it and let it chain cast over 1 cycle, it'll heal him for 6% health and give him a 50% damage buff. This is relatively easy to deal with early on in the fight. You'll only ever get a Grace Droid every other wave in both story mode and hard mode, and you only ever get 1 at a time. So as long as you look out for that green marker, don't lose track of it, it's really not that dangerous. Only time it's really worrisome is if you get into burn phase and lose track that there's a Grace Droid and no one picks it up and kills it. Then it'll keep healing and buffing Tyth, and it extends the burn phase long enough that usually that can be very, very difficult because the longer he's up, the more stacks of rage he's going to build, and he might overload and wipe the group. That being said, the Grace is a powerful tool. If you get behind on rage, you can let it chain cast to get his stacks of rage down. So even though that is a danger, it's also kind of a helpful tool depending on your group's composition and strategy and kind of where things are at. And last, but certainly not least, is the Guardian Droid. It's marked by a yellow marker, and these guys don't do too much. They have a ranged attack called Guardian Blast that deals some damage, but isn't that big a deal. The main thing is they're quick. They will, even though they'll move into melee range of their player with aggro, which means that if it's either a tank picks them up and then gets pulled in for inversion to tank swap, or if healers or DPS either have their aggro or DPS pick them up to kill them, but they don't have time and have to run in for inversion, then you get their aggro. They'll follow you right in there, right into Tyth's cleave. And so that's these guys, if you're progging this for the first time with a group that is also doing it for the first time, so you have a lot of experienced players, and that's where it can take you a while to get through this fight sometimes. The Guardians are going to be, 70 to 80% of any wipes you may see are probably going to be because of those idiot droids running underneath Tyth. So those are the most dangerous, those are the ones to keep track of. Those are the ones that, if it's about to be inversion, you got to have your DPS just nuke those suckers. If you know inversion's about to happen, if inversion's going to happen, we talked a little earlier about kind of positioning yourself on the side of the circle so they follow you into the side of Tyth and then hopefully follow you out behind him. Everything you can do dealing with those is all about keeping those Guardian Droids out from under Tyth. Okay, so now let's talk about how tanks deal with burn phase. From a DPS perspective, this is pretty simple. We're picking up here with the boss at 50%. DPS, usually this means once you get below 30 and you know that Intensify rage is starting, which means now you're now going to be net negative in rage even if you do nothing, you really can't afford to kill ads at all. Ideally, you kill a bunch of ads and then you get his stacks real low and then you push below 30. If your group's really coordinated, you can do that. Otherwise, once you get below 30, you can't kill ads. Now, so we're not quite to 30 yet, so we're doing our normal swap. The main thing you're going to have to decide from a strategic perspective is, number one, who's going to deal with the Grace Droid, because you can't lose track of it, or else it's just going to chain spam heal the droid. So there it got off 1 heal. Not a big deal, because on the one hand, this is helping us keep our rage stacks low, but we're not to to 30 quite yet, so that's actually good. We're at 5 stacks. That's a little bit high. But once you get below 30, what are you going to do? Are you going to, if you continue to tank swap, you can do that, but there's going to be a lot of adds, which is going to make it very, very difficult to avoid being, to avoid them running you under the boss. There I use bindings, which works really well for assassin tanks, to clip the group, and now the other tank's going to need to grab them, which he just barely does. Usually you can coordinate with AoE taunts, but now we're below 30. So now we're under the gun. We can't really deal with adds anymore. We just had the 2 Justice Droids. We're at 4 stacks, so not bad. So here I'm turning the boss, trying to dodge things. Wide conal because he's at 6 stacks. So now we're getting ready to do inversion. So what we're going to do is we're not going to tank swap. But we still have to deal with this mechanic for inversion where someone has to stand out. So the way you do it is the tank with the aggro of the boss runs out. The other tank runs in, and so I get thrown in. Notice I get thrown in, the adds follow the boss right out, and then boom, I keep aggro on the boss. Now what's dangerous is you get stacks of meltdown. I'm at 5 stacks, you can see there on my debuff bar, which means I'm only getting 50% healing, which also means if you have med packs or self-heal abilities, it's best to use early in this phase. But there we're able to do it relatively quickly. We do get one big rage storm, so we take some damage, but we're able to kill him. So not perfect, but pretty good. Let's see this from another angle. Okay, so now we'll see it from the perspective of DPS, but again, keep your eye on the meltdown stacks as we get to 30, and you'll see we're doing exactly the same strategy where the tank that's holding the boss steps out. That creates pressure on the other tank to get inside the inversion circle, which means it's really important that you keep, and this is true for melee DPS as well, keep a leap or gap closer. Don't use it to get out to adds. It's better to run out. That way you've got that available to zip back in, or if you've got a Sage or Sork in your group, make sure they have their pull available to pull you to them, that kind of thing, so you don't have someone stand out. Having a DPS out can be really dangerous because of the way those inversion buffs work. It can be easy to for them to pull aggro. So we're dealing with adds here. We're going to get pretty high on rage stacks, and in order to deal with that, we're actually going to have to let the Grace Droid get out 1 or 2 casts to get, so we're at like 8 stacks. That's really, really high. We're running in here for inversion. That's happening now. We're at 7, we're at 6. We're going to drop 1 more from Decay and then get it back at 7. And so we're at 6 here, so we're a little bit high. We're going to let the Grace Droid get 1 cast out to get us down a stack. Then we're going to kill the Grace Droid. We probably would have been pretty safe to let it finish that extra cast and get just a little more cushion. But we're at like 10% here, and so then we just, this point, we know we're at 8. We have time for 2 more Intensify Rages. Grace Droid's dead, so we just nuke the boss. Here you can see that our tank is at like 8 stacks. They're basically not getting any heals. And then we do get a Rage Overload there at the end, right as we kill him. We actually kill him slightly before the damage. Then we just clean it up. So again, it's tough to have an exact strategy for this here as we're cleaning up adds here. What I suggest is just whoever's responsible for dealing with the Grace Droid, and then what are your tanks going to do? Those are the 3 most important roles to decide what you're going to do. When are you going to go to burn phase and stop swapping? Because once you stop swapping, you know, you're really putting a clock on how long your tanks can stay alive, because after a period of time, after about 30-40 seconds of that, they're basically not going to be getting any heals. So healers can go ham early, but then late, you know, some tanks, you know, some of your better defensives for DR are going to work really well. Ones that have self heals like Grit Teeth for Jugs and Guardians, not going to work really well. So it can be very risky there. And if you lose a tank unexpectedly and you don't pick him up like immediately, then he's going to turn and cleave the group, and then that's a wipe unless he's at like 1%. It's worth noting you can't mitigate the Rage Overload at all, so just know that. But otherwise, that's key. And then the other is whoever's dealing with Grace Droids, what are you going to do? Because if he's at above, in my mind, if you're below burn phase, if you're like 30, if you say 35-40%, and the boss is at like 5 or 6 stacks, I'd let him cast a little bit, give him a little extra health, but get those stacks down so you go into burn really clean. Once you're in burn, once you get above 6-7 stacks, I'd let him cast a little bit. It extends the phase, but again, you're dealing with rage. So here we lost the tank. This is a bit dangerous, but he's really, really low. So he cleaves the group, or he's about to, but we kill him anyway. So a lot of judgment calls here, but thankfully there is a really cool trick that I'm gonna show you now. Okay, so now we've explained all this. I'm going to explain to you how to basically cheat the system here. So you go 1 tank, 6 DPS, and 1 healer. You need one of your DPS to be a DPS with taunt, and preferably one with good defensives, which most DWTs, Jug, Guardian, PT, Vanguard, Shadow, Assassins have a variety of good defensives. And probably a good idea to have him equip a shield just to get a little extra shield chance. But anyway, goal is you're gonna nuke him so fast because he has so little health that you're gonna kill him before healing becomes a problem, because you're only gonna get like 2 ad waves, if that. So here we get the first inversion. He's already almost to 60%. So that's after 20 seconds. So you'd go ahead and do a tank swap here where you have a DPS with taunt pick up the boss so that you get the meltdown debuff to go away. Usually you do go ahead and kill the first ad wave, and at that point you're just gonna ignore ads after you get this first wave down. You can see here we're almost to 50%. We're gonna be almost to burn phase by the time we get the second wave, and then you have the DWT swap out, the tank swap backs in for burn phase. Here we lose the DWT. That is the risk to this strat, but since the time it happens is usually right when so we have to have someone stand out here to be safe. But there's no ads up, so we're actually pretty safe here, and we're just going to nuke the boss. We're at 40%. We kill the Grace Droid, either have the healer kite or have a DWT, preferably, or a ranged DPS pick them up, and then you just burn the boss. We're now sub 30, and we're just going to kill him. He's at like just a couple of stacks. Our tank is in good shape. We actually had a DPS, another DWT pick him up. And he's going to be dead really, really soon. The good news to this is it's so fast you don't have to worry about ads, because the timing is we're about to kill him here, and we're on like our right as another wave comes up, so not a big deal, and you just nuke him down. And he goes so quickly that it just usually isn't that much. You may still wipe, but you're going to do it so quickly, it's just honestly not a huge deal. And even here at the end, if he cleaves a bunch of people, it doesn't matter, because we've got so much DPS that we've got half again the DPS, so it goes by really, really quickly. And this is really great. You do it properly the first way, but for progging it when you just need to get a kill so you can move on to those later bosses, really recommend this strat. Okay, everyone, thanks for watching my guide. I know it's like a almost 40-minute video for a fight that if you do the 6 DPS strat takes like 45 seconds, a minute long or whatever. But tried to do a relatively deep dive. It's a fun fight. It's a bit random, a little more random than I'd personally prefer for a first boss. Although the 6 DPS strat's really, really great. It's a great introduction. Gods is a lot of fun. It's a challenging fight as you learn it, but then once you get the hang of it, it's not too bad. This fight, more than some others, is a little trickier, especially if you're trying to set up lockouts and you're not running your normal team. So either the tanks, in particular, don't have a real great rapport, can sometimes make this fight a bit difficult. But again, just keep your eye on the stacks of rage. Everyone does inversion properly, and then you just coordinate when you go into burn phase and what you're going to do as far as the swaps and the Grace Droid, and you shouldn't have too much trouble. So I hope this was helpful to you. Best of luck in Gods, best of luck in SWTOR, and thanks for watching. Thanks.